Have you ever thought of real estate as a professional career? Many people have, and little wonder. It's an exciting, important, and rewarding profession. But the real estate profession is also a demanding one, and that's something few people realize.
Make for an appointment now.
Over the course of 4 programs, we're going to take a look at just how demanding. And by doing so, help you decide if you're truly suited to a career in real estate. Welcome to the second of 4 programs in our series, A Career in Real Estate. I'm your host, David Higgins, and I've been a real estate practitioner and a licensed broker for 22 years. And it's my intention over the course of this series to give you insight into what it means to be a real estate professional. We began that exploration in Program 1 with an overview of the profession. We looked at 8 areas of specialization within the real estate profession, the meaning of professionalism to real estate practitioners, the demands of the profession, the rewards of a career in real estate, as well as the extensive licensing process. We also gained an awareness of some of the technical skills and personal attributes that real estate professionals need to possess. Over the course of the next 3 programs, we're going to explore the 7 stages of a typical real estate transaction. Starting today with the listing function, we're going to learn about the agency relationship, methods of obtaining listings, drawing up the listing agreement, and appraisal techniques. Now, we've chosen to follow a residential resale because that's the type of transaction with which most people will be familiar. So what makes the listing function such an important part of that transaction that we need an entire program to deal with it? 2 things. First, it's the footing on which the structure of a sale is based. How soundly and smoothly a transaction evolves depends on the quality of the listing agreement that you put together. Secondly, it creates one of the key concepts within the real estate profession, the agency relationship. The relationship between you as a real estate professional and the person contracting your broker to either buy or sell a property. Under that relationship, you are working totally on behalf of that person, which is not as easy as it sounds. Let's take an example. A vendor authorizes your broker to offer their property for sale. It's not uncommon that you as the salesperson would actually spend the majority of your time with potential purchasers, working closely with them, getting to know them, even becoming friends with them. In fact, you may never even meet the vendor. Yet, you're working for that vendor. And if that purchaser, the person you have come to know and like, tells you that they can actually go higher than their written offer, you're duty-bound to let the vendor know. And that could be a hard line to walk, both professionally and personally.
The agency relationship in real estate is a relationship between primarily 2 people. One called the broker, who is going to be doing the work. The other person, normally the vendor, who hires that broker.
The best interests of the vendor are what the broker is endeavoring to maintain. And that's something that when you're working with purchasers and when you're advertising and everything else, you always have to remember, my vendor comes first.
The 3 things that you have to be aware of in your relationship with the vendor would be good faith, obedience, and competence. I think it's really hard when you're new in real estate as a sales rep, remembering that you are working for the vendor.
On the other hand, I've worked with this purchaser through the times, pre-qualifying them, waiting for them to save their money, taking them through different types of property. I've really gotten to know this purchaser and know where they're coming from, and they may in fact almost have become like a friend to me. It becomes very difficult when it's time to buy the house because this underlying principle that I'm working for the vendor exists. It's a complicated place to put yourself.
If you don't tell the vendor your principal all of the pertinent information about the information the buyer has made you aware of, you're not being a professional, and the legal liability there could be horrendous.
Your true obligation is with the seller, and that becomes extremely difficult when you've never even met the seller before.
And we can get some quite confusing relationships then developing. The purchaser thinks that the salesperson is his and the vendor thinks that that salesperson is his or hers. And the salesperson then is in the middle, sometimes with quite divided loyalties.
This whole question of whom you represent and whether it's difficult to represent one party and being fair to the other party is not a difficult question if you're mature and professional. A mature and professional salesperson will disclose fully their role with either party, and no matter how friendly they are with the buyer, if they have an agency agreement with the vendor, there's absolutely no question about who they represent. So it's not a friendship situation, it's a professional relationship.
It would be little exaggeration to say that the agency relationship is really the foundation of the real estate profession. If that relationship has been struck with a vendor, then you are working on the vendor's behalf. However, it's also important to understand that you are morally bound by the ethics of the real estate profession to treat the purchaser fairly, honestly, and ethically. Walking that line requires something of you as a person that we discussed in the previous program: professionalism. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the listing itself. This computer is connected to a local real estate board's multiple listing or MLS service. Every entry represents a home that is for sale. But how do you go about obtaining a listing? How do you convince people to turn their home, the most important thing they own, over to your care?
Procuring listings, getting your portfolio of listings is probably one of the most difficult things to do. And for every individual has the way that they do it best.
How I convince a seller to use myself as their listing rep, I firstly sit down and explain everything I do to get their home sold. Rather than have a wishy-washy approach, I sit down with a plan of action of exactly what I do to get their home sold. I show them all the marketing that I do to make buyers aware of their home. I sit down and I talk to them about the company that I work with and all the programs that we have to help get their home sold.
A lot of people will farm an area, and that simply means that they'll take a specific area in their familiar area and work it intensively. They'll knock on doors, they'll introduce themselves to each resident, and they'll talk to them and get to know them. They'll send mailing material into the area. They'll send in calendars, various types of marketing information. And hopefully when people are thinking about selling, then the only person they think about is you.
Trying to get a listing or trying to turn someone you meet into one of your vendors. The skills, number one, are people skills. Do they like you? Do they trust you enough to invite you in your home and literally expose the financial details of their life?
Excuse me, Mr. Hibbert.
Yes?
Hello, my name is Liz Fisher. My friend Barbara suggested I might come by to see you.
Oh, yes.
Hello, how are you doing?
Pretty good, thank you.
Good.
Barbara told me you did a great job selling her house.
Well, that's always nice to hear. She also tells me you're having a little bit of difficulty selling your place. And that maybe we could help each other out.
Difficulty would be a diplomatic way of putting it.
Not too much interest so far?
No, a few people have wandered through, but nobody interested in buying.
Well, quite frankly, I'm surprised. This is a great neighborhood. And, at least from the outside, it's a beautiful house.
Yes, well, I've tried to keep it up, but I'm just not what you'd call a born salesman, and what with my divorce and all. Barbara mentioned that?
Yes, she did. It's a trying time, I imagine.
Yes. Well, with all that going on, I just haven't been able to put in the time and effort that's required.
Well, it's a long process. Now, I've got some pointers I can offer you if you're interested, or my services if you decide you'd like to list.
I don't know.
Well, I don't want to push you on this, but maybe we can set up some time when you've got some time to spare.
Oh, well. Look, I just put some coffee on. Can't hurt to hear what you have to say.
Great!
Okay. Do you always work on the weekends?
What's a weekend?
Their home is probably their single biggest asset, or perhaps their biggest liability, and they're really taking you in their trust. So the trust part, the people part, is first. It's up to you, though, to use sales skills to turn that trust into a legal contract and turn it into a business relationship.
It has to be a very focused thought process, because you can waste a lot of time if you're doing it on a hit-and-miss basis. If you're doing something on a regular basis and people get to expect your material or your call or your knock on their door, then, there's an impact there. If you don't, it doesn't work.
A lot of my listing leads come from people that I know, acquaintances. It could be family members, it could be social.
Another way, and a way that I used when I first came into the business, was through a few social groups that I belonged to. And basically, those are the areas that I worked. I let those people know that I was in the business, that I wanted their business, and that I would do a great job for them.
It's very important for you to have as wide a client base as you can get, and everybody knows somebody who's thinking of selling, and it's up to you as a new sales rep to cultivate those people.
In the early years of the business, it was a door knocking on doors thing. Now most of my listings over the last number of years have come by referral. I have built up a good solid base over the 20 years that I've been in this business, and I would say that probably 90% of my business is now repeat business or referral business from past clients.
I think what you have to determine is what works best for you, and then work at it. Listings don't fall into your lap, and you do have to ask for them and go out there and get them.
There's a saying in the real estate profession, you have to list to last. And what we just saw and heard set out very clearly what it takes to be successful at listing. First, you have to realize that procuring listings is an ongoing operation. And that operation needs to be approached in an organized and planned fashion. Second, you have to be a self-starter. You have to show initiative. No one is going to go out and get listings for you. That's your job. And third, all the initiative in the world won't do you any good if you don't have the people skills to go along with it. I can't say it enough. This is a people business. You need to like people, like working with people, and most importantly, you need to understand people. Understand what motivates them in order to provide the services they need. Now, once someone has agreed to list with your brokerage, the next step is to formalize that consent with a listing agreement. There is no other form that you will encounter more on a day-to-day basis as a real estate professional.
The listing is broken down into two parts. The first part of the listing is the detailed particulars portion. And that's very technical information, and I probably advise a salesperson to concentrate on doing that part of the job right.
The first thing that I do with a new listing is to inspect the home, looking for any extra upgrades that the home may have above average than other homes in the area.
Checking the hydro to see what type of hydro is coming into the property, whether it's 60 amp or 100 amp, whether the furnace is gas or gas forced air or hot water heating, and whether it is forced air or whether it's radiant heat or electric heat, or all those different things. You want to make sure that you cover all the bases when you're doing that.
Basically, you have to measure a house. You have to be able to put the information about the house onto the listing form.
I do a detailed inspection room by room, measuring all the rooms.
Now, if you could just hold this to the pantry, we'll get this last measurement. Okay, great. Thank you. Now let's look at what you've got.
I want to see any mortgages to make sure that they have either discharged them or they haven't discharged them, what mortgages they do have on the property.
This is the mortgage. I have no liens outstanding. I don't know, as far as I know. Here title?
So in the deed, you're going to find things like easements. It may show on the survey as well. You certainly have to have a tax bill and an assessment notices of some value too. So you go through, let him collect all of those things, sit down and get them out of the way.
I want to know everything that there is possible to know about that property.
Whether there are any easements on it, whether he's got a hydro easement or a bell box on his lawn, whether there's a right-of-way across it, various things like that. But on the listing agreement, there are specific places for this information to be filled in, so it's necessary to have it.
Another step that I think is very important is I walk through the house with the vendor again and say, is there anything screwed in, bolted down, or permanently affixed that you want to take with you? Those are called fixtures. Conversely, I say, is there anything in the house you might want to leave? Chattels, the fridge and stove, washer and dryer.
I like to fill out a listing form in front of the vendor because I like them to participate in it. I mean, this is a joint effort. This is not something that I'm doing and he's out of the picture. We're doing this together and there has to be that cooperation, so it might as well start right from day one and with the listing agreement. So if he feels a part of that, he's probably going to be happy to tell me about the things that I need to know about his property.
The second part of the listing is the authority portion, which outlines the broker's responsibilities and the vendor's responsibilities. It's at this point that you probably talk about what the salesperson is going to do for the vendor, about advertising, marketing. You'll talk about keys, you'll talk about open houses.
So what happens now?
Well, my first steps include putting a sign on your front lawn, and then going back to the office and making a thorough check of the files there to see if we have any potential buyers on file.
What's my role then? Or do I have one?
Well, that's a good question. Here, this is what I'm going to leave with you. Now, this should tell you basically what you can do to help us show your home to its best advantage. Now, personally, I prefer it if you're not here during the showings. Just find that the buyers are a little bit more relaxed when the owner isn't around. But don't worry, I'll give you plenty of warning before I bring somebody over.
Now, suppose, say, someone sees the sign and just knocks on the door.
Well, we'll never send anybody over who's not accompanied by a sales representative. But on the off chance that somebody does come to the door, simply direct them to the sales office and just give me a call to let me know.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I'll keep you up to date on all of the showings, and when somebody does make an offer, we'll simply make an appointment with you and your ex-wife, sit down, I'll explain the offer, and then basically it's up to the two of you to determine whether it's acceptable or not. Okay.
After viewing the home, we usually sit down in the kitchen table, dining room table, and I explain to them what my first impressions were of the home, because that's what the buyer is going to see, that first impression, and you know what they say about first impressions. I give them tips on how to make their home more marketable, the condition of the carpets, the decorating, painting, anything that could be very minor change that could have a high impact on the first impression that the buyer has on their home.
It's important that the vendor understand at the beginning what the salesperson is going to do, so that there's no disappointments. I expected you to do this and you didn't. Get that all straightened out at the beginning.
It is a truism within the industry that a well-done job of listing is more than 50% of the sale. And as you heard, a good listing requires a great deal of time and effort to prepare. It also requires research skills. You have to be something of a detective, especially in your search for and examination of legal documents. English comprehension. That listing agreement has to be so detailed that another sales rep could draw a legal and binding agreement of purchase and sale without ever having seen the property. And it requires a certain degree of math proficiency. I'd like to talk in detail about that last point before moving on. The need for math in real estate. If you want to excel in this business, you need a solid grounding in math fundamentals, division, multiplication, fractions, and factors, to name just a few. As we just saw, you need math to properly describe land and measure area. And you need math in order to perform one of the most important functions associated with the listing, property appraisal. As you'll see, it's your job to determine how much a property is worth, and more importantly, how much it will sell for on the open market. There are three principal methods for appraising property. The direct sales comparison is the most common method used by real estate practitioners for determining the market value of residential properties. With direct sales comparison, you determine the value of a property by comparing it to the price of similar properties that have recently sold in the same neighborhood. 5 steps are involved. Research, where a number of comparable homes which have sold in the same neighborhood are located. Analysis, where all pertinent information on each property, both legal and physical, is compiled and checked. Comparison, where the differences between the properties are compared. Adjustment, where dollar values between properties are adjusted depending on differences. And reconciliation, where a final value is applied to the subject property. Now let's take a closer look at the adjustment and reconciliation process. Let's assume you're comparing a property which sold for $150,000 in January with a property being listed in April of that same year. The first element you need to calculate is the time-adjusted price. Did the value of the property increase or decrease during the 4 months between January and April? Since your research shows a price increase of 2% per month for the previous year, that means the comparable property would have increased in value by $12,000 over 4 months, for a present-day value of $162,000. Next, you would adjust for specific differences between the properties, such as location, a larger garage, fewer bathrooms, or better landscaping. A dollar value is assigned to each feature based on its market worth. The final step is to add the time-adjusted price to the total of other adjustments to arrive at an indicated value for the property that you are listing. Another method of appraisal is known as the cost approach. With this technique, you first estimate the land value as if the land were vacant and available to be put to its highest and best use. Next, you would estimate the current reproduction cost of the existing structure, accounting for any depreciation over time. Then you would add the land value to the depreciated cost of the structure. This approach requires extensive appraisal experience and the use of some fairly sophisticated mathematical formulae. Another appraisal technique is the income approach. This approach is associated with the buying and selling of investment property and is common to the IC&I field. With this technique, the operating income of the property is used to estimate the overall value of the property. To perform this calculation, you first need to derive the income stream and then convert that figure into a property value through a process called capitalization. No matter which technique you use, appraising a property is a demanding science and one of the most important tasks that you will undertake as a real estate professional. Property appraisal is also one of the most fascinating aspects of real estate and one of the most demanding. It doesn't take much imagination to calculate the consequences of a poor appraisal. A property priced too high simply will not sell, and a property priced too low costs both the vendor in terms of price and you in terms of reputation. So you need to be proficient in math, a minimum of grade 10 to begin with, and additional training as you gain experience or move on to other areas of specialization such as IC&I or appraisal itself. Well, that brings us to the end of today's program. Again, we've covered a lot of ground, and yet we've only looked at the first stage of a real estate transaction, the listing. We learned about the agency relationship, techniques for obtaining listings, drawing up the listing agreement, and property appraisal. We also saw the tools you need to possess at each of those steps: organization and planning, research, English comprehension, and math. And we added to our list of personal attributes, beginning with initiative. You need to be a self-starter. You need to be a good communicator and listener. You need to have confidence in your own abilities, and you need to be emotionally stable, because you're going to get rejections and have to put up with crazy hours and deal with the constant ups and downs of the business. In Program 3, we'll turn our attention to the marketing and selling of the listing. We'll learn how to find potential purchasers and to qualify them, both in terms of their needs and their finances. We'll talk to real estate professionals about the skills and knowledge and attributes required at each of those stages. And we'll continue to follow our real estate professional as she puts those principles into practice. I trust you'll join us.